June 25th, 2026, right now in the waters off Bandar Abbas, a U.S. carrier strike group, is sitting in exactly the same spot it occupied when the blockade was officially lifted a full week ago. Washington said the siege was over. CENTCOM posted publicly that enforcement had ended, that the fleet would stay in the region only to make sure the ceasefire stayed, in their own words, obeyed and in full force and effect. Read that line twice. The Navy didn't sail home. It stayed parked at the door watching. That is not a victory lap. That is a trap closing in slow motion, and almost nobody covering this story has said it plainly yet. Picture the actual scene for a second. A flight deck, jets chained down, sailors going through ordinary rotations. Nothing dramatic to look at, which is exactly the point. The most threatening thing the U.S. military can do to Iran right now isn't a strike. It's simply staying visible, doing nothing for as long as it wants. For 4 months, Iran's leadership told its own population that the Strait of Hormuz belonged to Tehran, that no American admiral would dictate terms in Iranian waters. Today, the same fleet that strangled their ports for 6 straight weeks is still floating offshore, and Iran cannot say a single word about it without admitting the obvious: the cards never actually left Washington's hand. Walk the timeline. February 28th, Operation Epic Fury, Supreme Leader Khamenei killed in the opening strikes. The war begins, and within days, flights across the Middle East are grounded, global shipping reroutes away from both the Gulf and the Red Sea, and oil markets lurch on every fresh headline out of Tehran. April 13th, a U.S. naval blockade chokes every ship entering or leaving Iranian ports, and by the Pentagon's own accounting, Tehran loses close to $5 billion in oil revenue before it ends 6 weeks later. By that point, monthly traffic through Hormuz, normally close to 3,000 vessels, had collapsed to barely 24 ships in an entire 24-hour stretch, and the International Maritime Organization was running the largest seafarer evacuation since the crisis began, pulling more than 11,000 stranded sailors out of the Gulf almost by hand. Pakistan, the country that would later broker the ceasefire itself, was already working back channels at this stage, long before anyone in Washington admitted talks were happening. June 17th, a memorandum signed almost as an afterthought, mid-dinner, at the Palace of Versailles. June 18th, the blockade lifts, and yet here we are, more than a week later, and the ships have not moved an inch. Something does not add up. And once you start pulling on that thread, the entire Iranian negotiating position starts to come apart on camera in front of the whole region. Here's where it turns almost embarrassing for Tehran. On June 20th, Iran's military command stood up and declared once again that the Strait of Hormuz was closed. The justification: Israel was still striking Lebanon, and Washington, in Iran's telling, had failed to enforce its own ceasefire terms. Tough talk, sovereign defiance, exactly the kind of statement built for state television and nothing else. Then Iran's own foreign ministry undercut its own military within hours. Asked directly by Tasnim News whether shipping had actually stopped, the response was that traffic was operating normally. Not paused, not restricted. Normal. One arm of the Iranian government told its public the strait was sealed shut. The other arm told the wire services the exact opposite, on the same day, before the news cycle had even turned over. Then the data landed like a hammer. On June 21st, the very next day, 16 million barrels of oil moved through the Strait of Hormuz in 24 hours. Not a wartime trickle, a record, higher than anything on the books before the war even started, a stunning reversal from those 24 ships a day numbers just weeks earlier. Vice President Vance went on Fox News and called it a figure going back to even before the conflict started. He was not celebrating peace. He was holding up Iran's own contradiction and letting the cameras finish the job for him. So which version is real? Is the strait closed the way Iran's military insists, or is it busier than it has ever been, the way Iran's own ministry and the shipping data both confirm? There isn't a third option here, and that's what makes this so damaging. Normally, a government can hide behind ambiguity, behind developing situation language that buys a few days of cover. Iran didn't even get a few hours. Tehran's two arms cannot even agree with each other in public, and the entire region is watching them fumble the story as it unfolds. This is not new behavior. It is the same play that ran back in April when Iran threatened to treat any U.S. naval presence near Hormuz as a ceasefire violation, then let commercial traffic resume within days through a temporary corridor Oman had to open just to keep some trade moving. That April blockade alone, by Trump's own claim, left 158 Iranian naval vessels destroyed, with only small, fast attack boats still operational by the time it ended. Trump, for his part, has spent this entire war alternating threats to bomb Iran's infrastructure back to the Stone Ages, with sudden offers to sit down and talk, his own version of the same whiplash. Threaten loudly, get walked back by your own diplomats 48 hours later. Repeat. The only thing that has changed since April is how thin the excuse is worn and how fast the contradiction gets caught on camera now. There is a principle from hostage negotiation that explains exactly what is happening here and has nothing to do with oil tankers or carrier groups. Negotiators call it leverage inversion. The instant a captor announces a threat they cannot actually enforce, the power in the room flips to whoever just called the bluff out loud. Iran did not just lose the Strait of Hormuz fight back in February when the war opened. Iran lost it again on June 20th, the moment its own foreign ministry contradicted its own military inside the same news cycle. You cannot close a waterway and tell the world it is open at the same time. The second you try, your threats stop functioning as threats. They become theater, and every government in the Gulf now knows it because they are all reading the same wire reports we are. We have actually watched this exact inversion happen once already this year. Back in April, Iran walked away from the Islamabad talks, declaring it would never negotiate under blockade. Within 5 weeks, it was back at the table anyway, having lost almost $5 billion, proving a point nobody outside Tehran was convinced by. The pattern repeats because the underlying weakness never changed, only the venue did. I have spent most of this year tracking exactly this kind of contradiction pattern where it surfaces how fast it gets reversed without anyone admitting it and what it tells you about the next move before that move actually happens. Not because contradictions are rare in geopolitics, every government has them, but because the gap between Iran's public statement and Iran's private behavior has become so wide and so fast moving that it now functions as its own kind of intelligence. That pattern tracking is the entire spine of the framework I lay out in the book, because once you can see the gap between what a government announces publicly and what it actually does 18 hours later, you stop reacting to headlines. You start predicting them days ahead while everyone else is still arguing about what the last statement even meant. That is exactly what is coming next here, because the contradiction over the strait was not an isolated slip. It is the identical playbook Iran is now running on the nuclear file in front of the same cameras with the same 48-hour walk back built in. And that is where this trap really shows its teeth. Let's break down exactly how Washington built this cage, piece by piece, because none of it happened by accident. Mechanism won the fleet that never left. CENTCOM ended blockade enforcement on June 18th, but the carrier group stayed in the Gulf to make sure the agreement holds. Its job is no longer combat. Its job is to sit there, silent and visible, as a standing reminder that the entire arrangement can be unmade the moment Washington decides it should be. Iran can declare the strait closed as many times as it wants. It still has to do so with an American flight deck close enough to read the hull numbers. Mechanism 2. The 60-day clock, Vice President Vance confirmed the countdown officially began on June 18th, the day after the ceasefire's enforcement clauses kicked in. 60 days is not a courtesy window. It is a pressure valve with a hard stop attached. Every contradictory statement coming out of Tehran between now and mid-August does not just look bad on television, it burns into a deadline Iran agreed to sign its own name to. The clock does not care who is technically correct, it simply keeps running, ready or not. Mechanism 3, the toll trap. Buried inside Trump's public threats is a financial lever almost nobody is talking about. If no final deal materializes, the United States has floated imposing its own tolls on traffic through the Strait of Hormuz, a waterway Iran has spent years insisting belongs to nobody but Tehran. Picture what that would actually mean in practice. An American toll booth sitting on the exact choke point Iran just spent a war and a blockade failing to control. It is less a serious policy proposal than a public reminder of who currently holds enough leverage to even threaten it with a straight face. Mechanism 4, the inspection trap, and this is the sharpest one of all. On June 23rd, Vance announced Iran had agreed to let IAEA inspectors return, calling it a major milestone toward ending the country's nuclear weapons capability for good. Within a single day, an Iranian diplomat pushed back in public, insisting that full access to the enrichment sites would only happen after a final deal was signed, not before it. IAEA Director General Rafael Grossi, standing in front of cameras in Japan, did not even pretend the two sides were describing the same agreement. He called it on the record a war of words. Here is the trap inside the trap. Iran cannot unlock sanctions relief or reconstruction funding without verified inspections, and it cannot allow verified inspections without revealing exactly what survived the February strikes and where the rest of it is currently sitting. It is worth being precise here because Tehran has quietly let inspectors keep visiting declared undamaged sites like Bushehr and the Tehran Research Reactor throughout the entire war. The fight has never been about access in general. It has always been about the handful of bombed enrichment sites Iran will not let anyone near, which happen to be the only sites that would actually answer the one question the whole world is asking. Stall on that access, and the clock keeps burning. The last fully confirmed IAEA estimate, now well over a year old, put Iran's enriched uranium stockpile at roughly 440 kilograms, enriched up to 60% purity. Nobody, not the IAEA, not Washington, not even Tehran, with full confidence can currently verify how much of that material survived the strikes or precisely where it is being stored. Vance has stated the goal of the ongoing talks is to lock that stockpile down so completely that rebuilding a weapons program from it becomes, in his own words, effectively impossible. That is not a sanctions threat dressed up as diplomacy. That is an attempt to permanently disarm a program that nobody involved can even fully locate right now. Mechanism 6, the frozen $300 billion, buried inside the June 17th memorandum, is a reconstruction fund, theoretically worth $300 billion, meant to rebuild Iran's shattered infrastructure with help from regional partners across the Gulf. Reporting around the deal has even floated routing some of Iran's own frozen assets through Gulf states to cover damage Tehran is accused of causing during the war, meaning Iran's path to rebuilding its own country may run directly through the same neighbors it spent the war threatening. Vance has been blunt about the catch attached to it. Not a single penny moves until Iran proves, through verified actions rather than statements, that its behavior has genuinely changed. The money sits on the table in plain view, padlocked, while Iran's own contradictory military statements keep handing Washington the exact justification it needs to leave it locked. 6 mechanisms, one outcome. The fleet, the clock, the toll threat, the inspectors, the stockpile, and the money are all built around a single insight. Iran's old strategy of loud public defiance, followed by softer private compliance, simply does not work anymore because the contradictions that used to buy Tehran breathing room at home are now the exact evidence Washington points to in order to keep every lever locked firmly where it is. None of these levers needed a single new shot fired to work. That's what makes this cage so effective. It runs entirely on paperwork, deadlines, and Iran's own contradictory press releases. And while this entire structure grinds forward in plain sight, Secretary of State Rubio is working the rest of the board without nearly as much attention. That same week, he toured Abu Dhabi for closed-door meetings and reopened the long-shuttered U.S. Embassy in Kuwait, more than 3 months after it was closed at the height of the war, locking regional partners into the framework so that whatever Iran decides to do next, it is negotiating before the entire Gulf, not just before Washington. Here is the theory that ties every single piece of this together. Iran is not confused. Iran is performing for 2 separate audiences at once, and the performance is starting to collapse in public on a schedule it cannot control. Audience 1 is domestic, a population that just watched its supreme leader killed in an airstrike, its ports blockaded for 6 weeks, its currency battered, and it needs to hear that the regime still controls something, anything, even a single shipping lane. Audience 2 is the negotiating table in Switzerland, where Tehran desperately needs sanctions relief, frozen assets released, and that $300 billion fund to actually start materializing before its own economy buckles further. No regime runs this kind of split act unless it genuinely believes it has no better option left. Publicly for Audience 1, Iran closes the strait, talks tough, and lets state media run the footage on a loop. For Audience 2, behind closed doors, it lets a record 16 million barrels flow through that same strait in a single day and quietly sends its foreign minister back to the negotiating table to keep working the deal. Both audiences are now reading the exact same headlines on the exact same day on the same phones. The gap between what Iran announces and what Iran actually does is no longer hidden behind a curtain. It is the story itself. Here is the fast roundup of where things genuinely stand, more than a week after the cameras packed up and left Versailles. Technical talks at the Bergenstock Resort in Switzerland wrapped an 18-hour overnight session that established 4 formal working groups, covering sanctions, the nuclear file, reconstruction funding, and verification. Mediators, Qatar and Pakistan, jointly called it encouraging progress. Iran's foreign minister separately claimed Tehran had secured waivers on its oil exports and the release of some frozen assets, claims Washington has not confirmed in matching detail. Beijing, which buys roughly a third of its crude through this exact strait, has publicly praised the deal, not out of goodwill, but because Iran's contradictions are bad for the one customer it cannot afford to lose. Lebanon's newly created deconfliction mechanism, meant to stop the Israel-Hezbollah exchanges for good, is already being called the first real test of the entire framework, even as Israel's prime minister insists his forces will hold a security zone in southern Lebanon for as long as he deems necessary. Inspectors are tentatively expected back at the table again early next week, with the access dispute still completely unresolved. So what actually happens next? There are only 2 real paths from here. Path 1, Iran keeps performing for its domestic audience. The public contradictions keep piling up week after week. The 60-day clock keeps burning down toward mid-August. And the $300 billion stays frozen while the regime's credibility erodes a little more with every mismatched statement. Path 2, Tehran quietly drops the closure theater entirely, lets the IAEA walk into the previously restricted sites, and trades the appearance of defiance for the money it actually needs to survive the next 12 months. There is no quiet third option where Iran simply waits this out. The clock doesn't allow for waiting. Watch the inspectors, not the press releases. The moment cameras catch them walking into a site that was off limits last month, you will know which path won, and if that hasn't happened by the time this clock runs out in mid-August, you will know just as clearly which path lost. Until that moment arrives, picture the scene almost certainly playing out somewhere inside an IRGC naval command post on the Gulf Coast right now. A junior radio operator trying to explain to a furious superior why the satellite feed shows record tanker traffic moving through a strait that state television declared closed barely 12 hours earlier. Sir, the ships, no sir. I said closed, sir. The numbers must be wrong, sir. Can you still hear me, sir? That is not a punchline written for laughs. It is the literal, measurable gap between Tehran's announcements and Tehran's reality, repeating on a loop every single week since the 17th of June. The Mullahs did not lose this war on February 28th. They are losing the peace right now. One contradicted statement at a time, with an American carrier group parked offshore for the sole purpose of making sure everybody is watching them do it. And that, more than any missile or memorandum, is the actual story of this ceasefire. Not who won the war, but who controls the silence afterward. Right now, that answer is not Tehran.